Officer Daniel Carter had spent over a decade patrolling these streets, but his career wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about power. He took pride in his authority, in the way people obeyed without question. He relished the flicker of fear in their eyes when he pulled them over, the hesitation in their voices as they answered his questions. Some of his colleagues had noticed his methods, the way he seemed to single out certain individuals more than others. But no one ever spoke up. Carter was always careful, just careful enough to avoid trouble. That morning, he was parked on the side of a quiet street, sipping his coffee while scanning the sidewalk for anything or anyone that might catch his interest. He wasn't in a particularly bad mood, but he wasn't in a good one either. He just needed something to break the monotony of the day. Then he spotted her. A black woman walking down the sidewalk, sharply dressed in a fitted blazer and tailored slacks. The soft click of her heels echoed against the pavement. She carried herself with confidence, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. Something about her immediately irritated him. She looked too sure of herself, too untouchable. Carter had seen people like her before, those who thought they were beyond his authority, those who believed they didn't have to show respect. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she approached. There was no real reason to stop her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but something inside him told him he should. His hand moved toward his radio, then hesitated.
No need to call it in.
He could handle this himself. With a flick of his wrist, he turned on his sirens and pulled up beside her, rolling down his window. "Ma'am, stop right there." She halted, her face unreadable as she turned toward him. No fear. No defensiveness. Just calm, too calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter's grip on the wheel tightened. He wasn't used to that tone. It was firm, polite, but completely unafraid. "You got ID?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her wallet, and held it out. "Am I being detained?" His jaw clenched. He hated that question. Hated when people acted like they knew the law better than he did. "Just give me your ID," he snapped. Without hesitation, she handed it over. Carter barely glanced at the name before shoving it back at her. It meant nothing to him. "Never heard of you," he muttered. "This is a restricted area. Turn around. Hands behind your back." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Was it amusement? Annoyance? He couldn't tell. But instead of arguing, she simply turned, placing her hands behind her back. No resistance. No pleading. Carter frowned as he pulled out his handcuffs, snapping them on a little tighter than necessary. He waited for a reaction, a flinch, a protest, something. But she didn't give him the satisfaction. As he led her toward the patrol car, she finally spoke again, her voice steady but firm. "You're making a mistake." Carter let out a short laugh. "You people always say that." He shook his head as he pushed her into the back seat. "We'll see what the judge thinks." She sighed softly, shaking her head as she settled into the seat. "Yes," she murmured. "We will." Carter slammed the door shut and walked around to the driver's seat, a smirk playing on his lips. He had done this 100 times before. He already knew how it would go. She'd argue, demand a lawyer, claim discrimination. They always did. But in the end, it wouldn't matter. The system was on his side. As he pulled onto the road, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She sat still, eyes fixed straight ahead, expression unreadable. Something about her composure felt unsettling. But Carter shook the thought away. She was just another civilian, another person who thought they were above the law. By the end of the day, she'd know exactly who was in charge. Or so he thought. Carter kept driving, hands gripping the wheel tightly. Every few seconds, his gaze flickered to the mirror. She hadn't spoken much since he forced her into the back seat. No begging. No anger. No questions. The police station was just a few blocks away, but he had a better idea. Why waste time with paperwork when he could take her straight to court? She didn't deserve the usual process. She needed to stand before a judge, stripped of whatever arrogance she carried. He wanted to see her squirm, to witness the exact moment she realized how powerless she really was. Carter pulled up to the courthouse, yanked the door open, and grabbed her arm. He expected resistance, maybe hesitation. Instead, she moved with him easily, stepping out of the vehicle as if she had planned to be there all along. That only irritated him more. "You think this is funny?" he snapped, tightening his grip. Her dark eyes met his, calm, unwavering. "No, officer," she said smoothly. "I think this is interesting."
He scoffed.
"We'll see how interesting it is when the judge sees you." Inside the courthouse, Carter led her past the security checkpoint, flashing his badge at the guards. They didn't question him, they never did. They were used to seeing him bring people in like this, people he wanted to make an example of. He walked with confidence, boots echoing against the polished floors, his grip firm on her arm. The courtroom wasn't packed, but there were enough people to witness what was about to unfold. Lawyers, clerks, a few reporters scattered in the back. And then, of course, the judge. Carter smirked when he saw who was presiding, Judge Williams. An old-school, no-nonsense man who had no patience for disrespect. This was perfect. Carter shoved the woman forward just enough to make her stumble slightly as she approached the defendant's stand. "Your Honor," he began, his voice loud and clear. "This woman was found in a restricted area, refused to comply with my instructions, and is now being brought before the court for processing." Judge Williams barely looked up, flipping through his notes. "Name?" The woman straightened her blazer, smoothing out the wrinkles Carter had caused. Then, with complete ease, she spoke. "Danielle Reed." Carter sneered. "That's what her ID says. Probably fake." At that, the judge finally looked up, glancing between Carter and the woman. Something passed over his face. Curiosity? Recognition? But he remained composed. "Ms. Reed, do you have any representation?" Danielle smiled, not smug, not mocking, just calm and confident. "I won't be needing representation, Your Honor." Carter's smirk widened.
Perfect.
Another one who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. Judge Williams sighed, rubbing his temple. "Officer Carter, let me see the charges." Carter pulled out his notes and handed them over. The judge skimmed the paper, then looked up. "You arrested her for being in a restricted area?" "Yes, Your Honor," Carter answered firmly.
"She was trespassing."
"Refused to follow my instructions." The judge leaned back, glancing at Danielle again. "And where exactly was she?" Carter straightened. "She was walking near the federal courthouse, just outside the designated perimeter." Silence. Then, slowly, Judge Williams exhaled and shook his head. "Officer Carter, do you even know who Ms. Reed is?" Carter's smirk faltered, just for a second. "Some civilian who thought she could go wherever she wanted," he muttered. A soft chuckle escaped Danielle's lips. "Oh, officer," she said, voice smooth. "You really should do your homework." Before Carter could snap back, Judge Williams tapped his gavel against the bench. "Ms. Reed is a federal agent, Officer Carter." Carter's breath hitched. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier.
"What?"
"She's a senior investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the judge continued, his tone sharp. "A well-respected officer of the law. In fact, she works closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the very office that prosecutes cases like yours." A low wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lawyers exchanged glances. Carter's stomach twisted into knots. He looked at Danielle, expecting smugness, arrogance. But her expression was as composed as ever. Then, finally, she spoke again. "I told you," she said softly. "You were making a mistake." Carter's world tilted. He had arrested a federal agent, dragged her to court, humiliated her. And now, it was all unraveling in front of him. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. A cold silence settled over the courtroom. Carter felt his throat tighten, his pulse hammering in his ears as Judge Williams' words echoed in his mind. "She's a senior investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Carter's confidence wavered, but his ego fought to keep him standing tall. He had to regain control of the situation. His gaze darted around the room before landing back on Danielle Reed, still calm. Almost too calm. Like she had seen this coming all along. That can't be right, Carter muttered, his voice quieter now, the arrogance fading. He turned to the judge. You must be mistaken, Your Honor. She was in a restricted area. Judge Williams sighed, tapping his fingers against the bench. A restricted area that, as an active federal agent, she has full clearance to be near. His eyes bore into Carter's. His expression shifted, from irritation to something closer to disappointment. Tell me, Officer Carter, did you even ask for her credentials before arresting her? Carter's jaw clenched. He had taken one look at her, a black woman in professional attire, walking near the courthouse, and assumed she was somewhere she didn't belong. He hadn't asked for ID. He had just grabbed her, shoved her into his car, and driven her straight here, like she was nothing more than a package to be delivered. Danielle's voice was smooth, steady, not angry, not accusatory.
Just calm.
I did offer to show my badge, she said. But Officer Carter didn't seem interested. More murmurs rippled through the room. Lawyers exchanged knowing glances. Reporters sat up straighter, pens flying across notepads. Carter could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him. He swallowed hard, forcing his expression to remain neutral. She was being difficult. She refused to comply with my orders, he said, his voice tight. Danielle raised an eyebrow, tilted her head slightly. Is that what you call it? Her tone was light, almost amused, which only made Carter more frustrated. Judge Williams exhaled sharply. Officer Carter, he said, voice firm, let me make this clear. You arrested a federal agent without cause. You refused to check her identification. And you dragged her into my courtroom as if she were some street criminal. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? Carter stiffened. Your Honor, I